Welcome to the online discourse, the impact of nationalism and identity politics in fueling genocidal violence in South Asia, organized by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I'm your host, Rimsha Shahid, research analyst at SARIM, and today we have one of accredited human rights advocate, Dr. Alan J. Dr. Kennedy is an esteemed human rights advocate and the executive director of World Without Genocide, which is a non-profit organization that aims to promote education and advocacy to prevent and respond to genocide and other mass atrocities. Dr. Kennedy has dedicated her entire career to the study of human rights abuses, with a particular focus on genocide prevention and response. Her work with World Without Genocide has led to the creation of numerous initiatives, including educational programs for students, legal clinics for survivors of atrocities, and advocacy efforts aimed at influencing policy at the national as well as international level. Dr. Kennedy has received many awards for her work, including Outstanding Citizen from the Anne Frank Center in New York, Higher Education Leader of the Year from the National Society for Experiential Education, Outstanding Service Award from the Midwest Sociological Society, Community Service Award from the University of Minnesota, Human Rights Award from the UN Office of Church Women United, and Changemaker Award from the Minnesota Women's Press. Through her leadership and expertise, Dr. Kennedy has made a significant impact on the fight against genocide and other mass atrocities. Dr. Kennedy, I'm really pleased to have you as our guest, and I must say that you have a very commendable trajectory. I am confident that this discourse will you will turn out to be quite resourceful. Thank you for being with us.
It is my great pleasure to join you and our audience this morning or this evening, wherever we are reaching people. Thank you.
So now begin with my first question. Can you explain the relationship between nationalism and identity politics in South Asia and how they contribute to genocidal violence in the region?
It's a very complicated question, and I'm sure our listeners understand that. This is not a situation that is unique to South Asia. This is a situation that confronts us every day in the United States as well. We have to begin first by thinking about what nationalism truly means. Nationalism is a sentiment that expresses itself in avowing loyalty and allegiance to one's country, right or wrong, regardless of the stand that that country is taking. And it implies with it a cultural superiority that is embedded within that loyalty. That cultural superiority is framed by denigrating in some way other groups, hence the identitarian notion of it. Now, we see this in the United States all too clearly with our deeply rooted history of 400 years of racism. We see it expressed today so clearly in the US with the efforts by white Christian heterosexual men to affirm that identity as being congruent with what it means to be an American. We see the parallel today in South Asia, specifically within India, which is where I'll frame my remarks, with right-wing Hinduism. And again, I'm not speaking about all Hindus, of course. I'm only speaking about ultra-right-wing people within Hinduism who are affirming that to truly have an identity as an Indian person, one must adhere to an identity that is rooted only in Hinduism to the exclusion of all other identities.
So I will now move towards my second question, which is how do historical factors such as colonialism and partition play a role in the development of nationalism and identity politics in South Asia?
Colonialism at its heart is about difference. It is about othering. It is about one group, those who are doing the colonizing, asserting an identity and a definition that minimizes, that in many ways will denigrate all other identities, and that history of hierarchical expressionism carries forward long past the wars around the world that officially dismantled colonialism. We see this again in the United States, where the efforts to utterly eradicate the indigenous populations created that sense of othering based on issues of identity. And I want us to be very mindful that identity is always construed in different ways. It depends on the ways in which the group desiring hegemony tries to position itself. The Genocide Convention highlights 4 different elements of identity: race, religion, ethnicity, and national origin. But there are many other identity characteristics as well. Those are simply the 4 characteristics that the countries seated around the table, a metaphorical table perhaps, were able to agree upon at the time. So those characteristics, for example, do not include sexual orientation, gender identity, political affiliation, and so on. Those are the 4 characteristics. I have long used a very simple metaphor to look at the issue of genocide. And the metaphor that I use is that of an iceberg. Now, we all are familiar with the tragedy of the Titanic that struck an iceberg. The visible part of an iceberg is only a small part of that entirety of the iceberg. The part lying beneath the surface of the ocean is much larger than what lies above the surface. And I believe that genocide is like that. The part of identity above the surface is what is framed as in the Genocide Convention. Those 4 characteristics that I have just mentioned: race, religion, ethnicity, and national origin. Those are what I call the proximate or nearby, or they become the visible causes on which a genocide will be carried out: race, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. But that's not what really is driving genocide. Whether we're talking about South India, whether we're talking about Northwest China, Guatemala, or the genocide of the indigenous people in the United States. What's really driving these mass atrocities is what lies below the surface. And that is a struggle for political and economic control. It is that struggle by an elite to retain control over the resources that are increasingly at risk today because of the multiplier effect of the climate crisis. So we must look below the surface. In South Asia, the surface issues are driving the conflict, particularly the issues of religious difference. But that's truly not what it's all about. It's about governments, in particular the government in power today, that is doing all it can to preserve ultimate control over nearly 1.5 billion people in the area.
To accept that otherization it still exists in South Asia at a very early point, and this thing can lead to stereotyping prejudice, which can further perpetuate social inequalities and injustices. And as you also said, that mass atrocities are also the result of such sort of otherization. So yes, it is very important for individuals and as well as communities to recognize and address otherization to promote greater understanding and inclusivity as well, and to build stronger social ties in a more cohesive society. So, yeah, while now I would like to towards our third question, which is how did movements of genocidal violence, such as Bangladesh Liberation War, 2002 Gujarat riots, Sri Lankan civil war, Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, demolition of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, Sri Lankan Easter bombings in 2019, and recent escalation of violence in Kashmir illustrate the impact of nationalist and identity-based rhetoric in fueling violence.
Those episodes are truly heinous, and they result in what I see as a bifurcated response. So, a response that although it can exist along a broad spectrum of responses, it has two very distinct polar ends. On one side are those people who applaud the violence, who feel that their hegemonic position is being reinforced by those atrocities. They support the demonization of those groups who are being attacked. There is an othering that occurs that dehumanizes the group that is not within this hegemonic elite. And when that dehumanization occurs, it becomes easier to strike out because one is not striking out at what you and I would recognize as our fellow human beings on the planet. So, for example, during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, the people who were targeted, who were primarily of the Tutsi ethnic group, were referred to as cockroaches. And what do you do to a cockroach? You stamp it out. It is not something for which one would feel regret at taking that kind of action. I am a Jew. During the Holocaust, Jews were demeaned as being far less than human, and consequently, there was no, on the part of those doing the demonization, there was no social remorse, social compunction against acting out. So on one side, acts of violence can further legitimate other acts of violence. It can begin to set up almost a snowball effect to say these episodes are occurring within the body politic, and we will sanction them because they are occurring against a group, not against people, but against a group we are defining as being less than human on whatever standard might be invoked. And then there is the other response, a completely opposite response. And that is the response that brings together people across all of those identity boundaries to say, we will stand together. We will unite. We are part of our broader human family, and we will stand with, for, and alongside one another, always and forever. It is up to those of us who support human rights to rally the people to say we will stand with, by, and for those who are being made vulnerable. So again, it's a bifurcated response. Part of it, unless it gets checked adequately by those who stand against it, part of it will continue to explode. But it's up to the rest of those who believe truly that we are all one, to be able to say, wait a minute, we must look below the surface. We must put the checks in place. We must unite and rally. Again, if I can invoke what's happening in my own country, ever since the election of President Obama, there has been an increasing racist response within the United States to limit the equality of people of color, particularly of Black Americans. It has resulted in efforts to disenfranchise Black people, to keep them from voting. It has resulted in trying to exclude them from their rightfully elected seats in legislatures, in city councils, and so on. It has resulted in ongoing efforts at systemic discrimination across all areas of civil society. But the opposite is happening as well. There has been a uniting of people, again, across all spectrums, to say we are standing up. We call those people very simply upstanders. We will stand up with you, by you, and for you.
As we are currently discussing the response towards these sort of atrocities, and you being international human rights advocate, you are one of the ideal person to ask this question. Choose the next question, which is how can the international community intervene to prevent genocidal violence fueled by nationalism, identity politics in South Asia? Moreover, what steps can be taken at the local and as well as national levels to promote reconciliation and reduce tensions between different ethnic and religious groups in South Asia? As you might be aware that South Asia is a very diverse region, and people here resist to accept the diversity or accept the otherization of others. They usually otherize them and usually exclude them from every domain, be it economic, political, social, or religious. So, what, in your perspective, can be the measures for reconciliation sort of tensions?
I want to begin with a very macro level response to that. World Without Genocide is very honored and privileged to have special consultative status at the United Nations. And within that status, it allows us to attend meetings at United Nations headquarters and to become perhaps somewhat more familiar with some of the operations of the United Nations. In particular, I want to mention the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They are referred to as the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. These are lofty goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate gender inequality, to promote peace and fair and equitable institutions. Lofty, lofty goals. But there is a way that we can each translate those very lofty goals into a micro level response. So at World Without Genocide, for example, we have identified 5 goals of the 17 that relate directly to our specific mission. And every day when we have a staff meeting, we have a little framework and we meet online. And across the top are the 5 goals. And down the left-hand side, it says international, national, and local. And what we discuss is the way that these 5 goals are intersecting within our work at the international, national, and local levels. So we go from the macro, from the UN, the 17 huge goals: world peace, elimination of world poverty, to 5 goals that relate to our work. And then we drill down to how they even affect us on a very local level within which we operate. So, what I encourage people to do is to take a look at those 17 goals and to think, all right, how does our work relate to those goals? How can we begin to translate our work to go from the local to the global and back from the global to the local? And I have always said, always, that the local is the global and the global is the local. Any problem, any challenge, any issue that we witness or that we read about globally is also apparent in our own local neighborhoods. We would be foolish to think otherwise. So issues of gender inequality, of racial violence, issues like that, of religious intolerance, they exist next door to us. They might even exist within our own family networks. So understanding that connection from the macro to the micro, I believe, is truly critical. Now, on a very operational level, what can we all do? I'll give you a specific example. I teach at the law school where World Without Genocide is located. We are separate from the law school, but it's been my great privilege for more than a decade to teach at the law school, even though I'm not a lawyer. And I teach courses in human rights. I always have encouraged my students to run for government office, to work for the government, and even at a very local level, to think about having a membership in a local human rights commission, for example, or on their local city council. And last year, one of my former law students sent me a note, and she said, I really thought about what you said about joining the local Human Rights Commission. And I am now, she said, she wrote, a human rights commissioner in my town. I was thrilled. She lives in a suburb of our city, of our major city of Minneapolis, city of maybe 40,000 people. But what she has done is bring forward, listen to this, a United Nations Convention. There is a United Nations Convention called the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The acronym, so the letters of abbreviation, are CEDAW. And it goes by the name CEDAW. There are 6 countries on the planet that have not ratified CEDAW. And one of the 6 is the United States. We are not a good global player. People around the world do not realize it, but we are not a good global player. So World Without Genocide has been part of a nationwide movement to have cities ratify CEDAW as a way to bring this issue of discrimination against women to a very local level. One of the UN SDGs is to promote gender equality, for example. And of course, that's certainly an enormously difficult issue within much of South Asia. So what my former student was able to do was to bring forward a proposal to ratify CEDAW at the Human Rights Commission on which she is now serving. And then tonight, this very evening, it will go to a vote at the city council of her city. When the issue was brought forward at the Human Rights Commission, World Without Genocide was able to help prepare the presentation. And what we did, Ms. Shahid, was really powerful. We were able to get data that was, to many of the other commissioners, quite shocking, but very typical, about the number of femicides in that city, the number of women killed simply because of being women, We were able to get the number of domestic assaults, the number of orders for protection that women within that small town of 40,000 people, the number of orders of protection that women had sought to protect them from violence. So these issues came to the forefront. So what will happen then tonight is to link that United Nations Convention to this small suburb of 40,000 people around this issue of gender-based discrimination and violence. And it's being brought forward by my former student. The global became the local. The local will reverberate globally as well. Every one of us has an opportunity to do something, to choose an issue, whatever that issue might be, and to think about bringing it forward at whatever level might seem appropriate. So to me, this was a very encouraging step as a way to demonstrate that powerful connection.
I really appreciate you for encouraging your student, and I really appreciate your student, your former student, basically, who have done a great job of representing to mention at UN level, global level, which is really commendable, I'd say. And as you said that about SDGs, as you might be aware that Asian countries are usually poverty countries, and they are one of they are the third world countries. And the issue of discrimination or prejudice or biases is within society, and it is the problem of people's mindset, and which to reform this mindset is not cannot be like executed on a quick basis. It will take obviously a decade or some decades to eradicate such sort of thinking. So, how do you feel that social media or other forms of communication technology impact the spread of nationalist and identity-based rhetoric, and how can issue be addressed, and how the mindset of people at local level, mindsets of laymen can be changed or reformed in a better way?
It's a terrible problem, truly a terrible problem. And again, there is a bifurcated response. Social media can be such a potent force for good, such a potent force for good or for evil. We know that the genocide in Myanmar against the Rohingya people, for example, was certainly exacerbated by social media. The New York Times in 2018 broke that story that government trolls, Myanmar government trolls, facilitated violence through Facebook. This is horrific. There are steps that can be taken. For example, what's happening in the European Union is very powerful. UNESCO is a United Nations agency that advocates for collaborative cross-national efforts to promote peace. And UNESCO has become, as an agency, committed to addressing the global rise in anti-Semitism. So somewhat different than the anti-Muslimism, but still focusing on religious violence and religious persecution. So UNESCO is partnering with 12 countries within the European Union, and they happen to be 12 countries that were deeply, deeply affected by atrocities of the Nazi regime of the Third Reich. And one of the issues that UNESCO is going to be addressing is how to set up guidelines, very specific guidelines for social media operation within the European Union. So this is happening at a global level through UNESCO, through the United Nations, but it's also happening at a national level from countries that are being engaged. Now, UNESCO is also reaching out with programs to train teachers and to bring programs to schools to combat anti-Semitism. So again, it's going from the most multinational United Nations to the most local schools. This is a 2-year effort just launched by UNESCO. I do not know how long it took to move it to the operationalization stage. I imagine it's been in the planning process for many years. And that's something that we have to recognize, that these steps are long in working forward. And I want to share the words of my hero, my personal human rights hero. His name is Benjamin Ferencz. Ben Ferencz passed away on April 7th, so very recently. And he passed away at the age of 103. He was the last remaining prosecutor from the Nuremberg war crimes trials that were held after World War II. He was a prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing squad that was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million Jews. And he was 27 years old when he got guilty verdicts for the dozens of men he was putting on trial. It was the first trial of his life, 27 years old. And at that moment, he developed a commitment to human rights that he acted on for the remainder of his very long life. And he had a 3-part motto. Part 1, never give up. Part 2, never give up. Part 3, never give up. And that is what I say to you and to all of our listeners today. And that is that human rights moves forward at a glacial pace. And we may feel that we are taking a small step forward today, but perhaps it could be 3 steps backwards tomorrow. But we must use Mr. Ferencz's words as our guide. Never give up, never give up, never give up.
So as you say that never give up in life of anything. So do you think that is it possible to promote a sense of national identity in South Asia without exacerbating distinct ethnic and religious tension? And what do you think that what role political leaders institutions can play in mitigating nationalist and identity-based conflict in South Asia?
I think that's such a critical question. In general, the issues above the surface of that iceberg, race, religion, ethnicity, and national origin, play a greater role when the issues below the iceberg have the greatest instability. When the elite is struggling to retain control, when economics are most imperiled, when political control is most at risk. And we are at an inflection point all over the world for several reasons. First, the war in Ukraine has truly been a tipping point economically. Second, we are only now beginning to recover from a global pandemic that truly affected every country's economy in horrific ways. And then third, the climate crisis that is only getting worse. And it is affecting countries most severely in the global south by the actions of the countries regarding fossil fuel use who are in the global north. So I fear we are not looking at a rosy future at this moment. But that means that those of us who are trying to build the bridges, who are trying to protect those who are the most vulnerable, face a greater opportunity. Let me put it in a positive way. We face a greater opportunity to move forward, to build coalitions, to reach across, to literally hold hands across these divides and say, we are one. We can work together. It requires, at these times of potential greater polarization, to say we will not allow this to occur. We see this in the United States in horrific ways. We are seeing the worst spike in anti-Semitism in the United States in the 40 years that the records have ever been kept. Jews are being murdered in synagogues. They are being assaulted on the streets. It is horrific. We are seeing the targeting of transgender people, a small minority of people with horrific violence, particularly transgender women of color. But this is the moment for people to stand up and say, we will not stand idly by. We will reach out. We will try to preserve and protect the human rights of those who are the most affected. So again, I fear that our future brings us greater moments of crisis and opportunity than it has before.
While going through the profile and efforts of the organization, I came to know that the very organization uses, among other tools, education as the core tool to mitigate the genocide violence and to raise awareness among masses and among public. What do you think that how can education cultural exchange programs be used to promote tolerant and understanding groups?
Any kind of opportunity to bring people together fosters positive results. When we have a chance to engage in conversation, or particularly to share food, that creates friendship, it creates alliances. It is just wonderful. So when I think about some of the efforts that we have tried to do, I've mentioned that I am a Jew. When I try to write about these issues, it is across the religious spectrum. So to engage with people who are Muslim, Hindu, Christian, or people of no faith, to say we share a common concern for these issues. When people of many different identities can come together in a public-facing way that can encourage other people to think perhaps a little bit beyond their own boundaries. And certainly any kind of cultural exchange, particularly to be in another country, to be in another setting, enriches our perspectives in ways that nothing else can do. But even simple steps, reading books about other cultures, watching movies, visiting restaurants, sharing meals with people in our own neighborhoods. All of these are so wonderful in broadening and engaging us within our human family.
As the organization holds a commendable trajectory in mitigating the genocide violence, and as you said, that any initiative that bring together people and people mainly from communities and different societies can create a great impact with the society. So I would like you to discuss about what are some of the successful examples of peace building initiatives in South Asia, specifically initiated by World Without Genocide, that have addressed the root causes of genocide violence fueled by nationalism and identity politics. And what lessons can we learn from these initiatives in today's world current time?
Again, we all can do something on a small scale. A conversation like this, for example, for you to invite me as a Jewish person, as a woman, and as an American to speak about these issues is a boundary spanning moment. And I'm very honored and very grateful for it. I want to share the story of what the capital city in my state of Minnesota took on, the city council. The city is the city of St. Paul. And in 2019, members of the city council became informed about the situation in South Asia, in particular in India, for many Muslims in India who were being targeted for their identity, for their religious identity, in ways that were setting them apart, that were excluding them from full participation in civil society. And the city council chose to become very public about it. So the city council authored a resolution of support for the people in South Asia broadly and specifically within India, saying that they supported the Muslim people in their identity and they stood by them and so on. And they reached out to World Without Genocide and specifically to me and said, would you support this issue as well as an NGO? And I said, absolutely. So World Without Genocide issued a resolution of support. And then following that, members of the city council received hundreds upon hundreds of letters and emails and phone calls, far more than they had ever received in the history of the city council, many of which expressed support, but many of which also were not issued in good spirit, and in some cases were threatening. And the city council stood strong and said, we stand by our statement. Our partners, and there were more of us than just our NGO, World Without Genocide, our partners stand strong. And I was able to work with people from across faith communities to publish an article in our local paper supporting that initiative as well. So it was a way to call out what was happening to South Asians, to say we here in a different country support the human rights of the people who are feeling very vulnerable, and we encourage other people to do the same. I have raised this issue as well in my public speaking. In fact, I'm doing a 5-part series of speeches for a college in the eastern state of New Jersey. And this Friday morning, I will be giving a talk about the situation in India. And it's not the first time. At World Without Genocide, we hold monthly webinars on issues of human rights concerns. And we have looked at the situation in South Asia as well. So we try to raise awareness. We support efforts to pass legislation. There was a bill in the previous Congress to address this issue. It did not go to a floor vote. We encourage it being brought back. We do what we can within our framework of operations to raise awareness and to encourage legislative action and policy to protect those who are vulnerable.
Great. It was really nice talking with you, Dr. Ellen. I really present my thanks for sparing your precious time for this discussion. Again, thank you for making such an insightful and thoughtful discussion. I hope to collaborate with you and your organization in future. Until then, good luck for your future projects and efforts.
Thank you, and thank you to all of those who were listening to us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Goodbye.